Hello, I am Hirin Lee from Michigan State University. On behalf of my co-authors, I will present a paper titled Configuring Humans: What Roles Humans Play in HRI Research. Who are the humans in human-robot interaction studies? The human component of HRI is what distinguishes the field from other science and engineering disciplines. Thus, HR researchers investigate robots in relation to humans and to society at large, rather than focusing solely on technological advancement. Given the significance of humans in HRI, this paper examines how humans have been incorporated in HRI studies and the extent to which they are granted agency. In this paper, we define agency as socio-culturally mediated capacity to act. In this definition, socio-culturally mediated implies that the capacity of human subjects is shaped through their interaction with their surroundings, such as other stakeholders in the context, physical environment, or culture. Through this interaction, humans are considered as agents who generate and convey meanings through their actions. Thus, analyzing how contextualization was incorporated in studies provides clues about how human agency is performed in previous studies. Capacity to act relates to collaboration, in that it describes how human participants have weight in the decision-making process of the research, such as adjusting research directions. We analyzed how humans have played a role in the studies published at the HRI conference between 2006 and 2021 by focusing on contextualization and collaboration. As a result of our analysis, we categorize the studies into three groups. The detailed information about coding scheme and coding procedure can be found in the methods section of our paper. Type 1 studies represent humans as generalizable humans. As these studies investigate human nature, all humans are considered interchangeable. Type 2 studies take into account that humans may interact with robots differently depending on their ages, occupation, or surroundings. In other words, these studies tend to incorporate at least one real-world aspect. Type 3 studies incorporate social and power dynamics among stakeholders as an important layer, in addition to including actual users and environment. Humans in these studies are not just located in the real world, but dynamically interact with other people. We also found 3 subcategories for type 2 as well as for type 3. Based on our analysis, we found that humans have mostly played passive roles in HRI research. Given that all approaches have their own strengths, it is difficult to tell what the best approach for an HRI study might be. However, considering the importance of humans in and the interdisciplinarity of the HRI community, the uneven distribution regarding human roles can be problematic. In terms of contextualization, as you can see from the table, 60% of the studies did not consider actual context in which robots will be used. 30% of studies considered people's context to some extent, yet human subjects were rarely allowed to interact with robots in the way they would in their everyday lives. In terms of collaboration, We found that only 5% of the studies allowed their participants to collaborate with the researchers. In the following slides, I'd like to discuss what opportunities there are for the HRI community, given an increased constellation of contextualization and collaboration. A dominant epistemology in science generally strives for generalizability and reproducibility. This may explain why a majority of HRI studies investigate human nature in response to robot appearance or behaviors by randomly selecting human subjects. However, they are not the only epistemological goals that researchers can pursue. Focusing on generalizability could make the issue of people with less voice invisible, because generalizability does not pay attention to individual differences. For example, although African American older adults develop dementia at almost twice the rate of other races, HRI studies exploring dementia have rarely included this population. Contextualization and collaboration have been considered as promising ways to address these new goals. Through contextualization, HRI researchers could understand how certain groups encounter different issues. Collaboration will enable HRI researchers to take their human subjects' situation into account. Being aware of epistemological goals that HRI researchers can choose, other than generalizability and reproducibility, would help diversify the knowledge in the HRI community. There are also opportunities for social justice. A traditional epistemology of science requires objectivity as an essential attitude of researchers. Through objectivity, researchers keep away from human subjects and society and observe them from a distance rather than engage with them. In contrast to objectivity, an action-oriented approach requires researchers' engagement with society and research participants through genuine collaborative process. Rather than keeping a distance, these studies aim to challenge existing power dynamics through the engagement. Considering the influence of robots in society, HRI researchers' active engagement with society and especially with socially marginalized groups could provide them with opportunity to act on society. While analyzing the studies published at the HRI conference, we found that socioeconomically underserved populations are one of the groups whose voices and knowledge are largely overlooked in our field. This might be due to the fact that we HRI researchers are mostly educated, middle class, and trained within developed countries. Those socioeconomically marginalized populations may also be far away from the researchers' own social networks. Reflexivity will help researchers achieve genuine collaboration with socially marginalized groups as researchers become sensitive to their unexamined biases. Since the influence of robots on society can be greater than that of any other technology, HRI researchers have a responsibility to generate knowledge of robots in a way that takes the influence into account. In this paper, we argue that the HRI community has several conscious decisions to make about how they incorporate humans, how we engage with society, and how we take responsibility for the robot that we generate. Thank you for listening to this talk.